Welcome to Worldwise, where we dive deep into current global affairs to help you understand the bigger picture. Today, we're tackling a bold and somewhat controversial question. Is the UK, one of the world's oldest and wealthiest economies, on the path to becoming what some critics are calling a third world economy? What's behind these alarming claims, and how real are the economic challenges facing the UK? Let's break it all down and explore the numbers, trends, and political decisions that have brought the UK to this critical point. Post-Brexit fallout. Was sovereignty worth the economic price? First, we need to start with Brexit. When the UK voted to leave the European Union in 2016, proponents promised that it would bring more control over borders, laws, and trade deals. But what has actually happened since the UK officially left the EU in 2020? Decline in trade. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, Brexit is expected to reduce the UK's long-term GDP by 4%. This may not sound like much at first, but in economic terms, a 4% permanent hit to the size of the economy is enormous. To put this into perspective, the Bank of England estimates that Brexit will cost the UK economy £100 billion per year, or about £1,000 per household. Foreign investment drops. Brexit has caused a significant drop in foreign direct investment. By 2022, FDI into the UK had fallen by 19%, according to the UK Trade Policy Observatory. Many multinational companies moved their operations to mainland Europe to maintain frictionless access to the EU market. Nissan, for example, significantly scaled down its UK operations, while companies like Sony and Panasonic relocated their European headquarters from London to Amsterdam. Impact on small businesses. The UK's new trade agreements with the EU have introduced tariffs and red tape that have hit small businesses hard. The Federation of Small Businesses found that 1 in 5 small exporters have stopped selling to the EU due to the increased costs and administrative burdens. The sectors hardest hit include agriculture, manufacturing, and food exports, industries that traditionally provide jobs in economically deprived regions of the UK. The UK's growth problem. Why is the economy stagnating? A major concern for the UK's economy is its lackluster growth. While the global economy has faced disruptions due to COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, the UK's sluggish performance stands out among advanced economies. IMF predictions. According to the International Monetary Fund, the UK is expected to be the worst performing major economy in the G7, with growth predicted at just 0.5% in 2023. By comparison, Germany's economy is set to grow by 1.5%, while the US is projected to grow by 2.1%. Productivity crisis. One of the root causes of this stagnation is the UK's productivity crisis. Productivity measures how efficiently an economy converts labour into output, and in this area, the UK is seriously underperforming. Over the past decade, the UK's productivity growth has been an abysmal 0.3% per year, much lower than the 1.8% per year seen before the 2008 financial crisis. Economists have referred to this as the lost decade of productivity, and it's a key reason why wages have stagnated and living standards have fallen. Declining business investment. Another factor behind the UK's sluggish growth is declining business investment. According to the OBR, business investment as a percentage of GDP is currently at 16%, far below the average of 23% for advanced economies. This is partly due to Brexit uncertainty, as companies are reluctant to invest in a country with an uncertain trade outlook and volatile political climate. The cost of living crisis. Why are families struggling to make ends meet? Let's now turn to the cost of living crisis, which is a pressing issue for millions of households across the UK. The crisis has been driven by a combination of factors, including rising energy prices, high inflation, and wage stagnation. Record inflation. Inflation hit 11% in October 2022, the highest level in 40 years. While inflation has come down somewhat, it remains elevated. One of the main drivers of inflation has been soaring energy costs, which have surged due to the war in Ukraine and global supply chain disruptions. The UK imports much of its gas, and higher wholesale prices have been passed on to consumers. As a result, energy bills have skyrocketed. The average household energy bill rose from £1,100 in 2020 to over £3,000 in 2023. Food insecurity. The rising cost of essentials like food and energy has had a devastating impact on low and middle-income families. According to the Food Foundation, 1 in 7 households, or about 9.7 million people, experienced food insecurity by late 2022. This is nearly double the number in 2019, before the pandemic and inflation spikes. Many people are now forced to choose between heating their homes and putting food on the table, a situation that has given rise to the term heat or eat. Housing affordability. Housing costs are another major concern. Average house prices in the UK have soared by 23% between 2020 and 2023, despite the pandemic. Meanwhile, rents have risen by an average of 12% in 2023 alone, according to Rightmove. Yet, wage growth has not kept pace, leaving many unable to afford decent housing. As of 2023, more than 14 million people were living in poverty, including 4 million children, according to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Austerity's legacy, the impact on public services. One of the key drivers of the UK's current economic malaise is the legacy of austerity policies implemented after the 2008 financial crisis. These policies aim to reduce the national debt by cutting government spending, particularly in areas like healthcare, education, and social services. However, the consequences of these cuts are now being felt across the country. The National Health Service, once the jewel in the crown of British public services, is struggling to cope with increasing demand and chronic underfunding. The NHS waiting list hit a record 7.7 million people in mid-2023, with patients waiting months or even years for essential surgeries and treatments. Staffing shortages are exacerbating the situation, with over 100,000 vacancies across the NHS. According to the British Medical Association, NHS funding as a percentage of GDP has fallen to 6.9%, well below the 9.9% spent by Germany on healthcare. Schools have also been hit hard by austerity. Between 2010 and 2020, funding per pupil fell by 8%, with the biggest cuts coming in the poorest areas. Larger class sizes, fewer resources, and underpaid teachers have become the norm in many parts of the country. This is having long-term consequences, particularly for children in disadvantaged regions, where educational attainment is falling. Social care services, which provide support for the elderly and disabled, are in an even worse state. Years of budget cuts have left the sector severely underfunded, with many local authorities struggling to meet basic demand. The Association of Directors of Adult Social Services has warned that the UK faces a care crisis, with an estimated 1.6 million people not receiving the care they need. Without urgent reform and funding increases, the system could collapse under the strain. Widening inequality, the divide between London and the rest of the UK. The economic problems facing the UK are not distributed equally. In fact, the UK has one of the highest levels of regional inequality in Europe. London and the South East are home to some of the wealthiest people in the world, while many regions in the north of England, Wales and Scotland struggle with high unemployment, low wages and poor living conditions. In 2023, the average annual wage in London was around £41,000, compared to just £28,000 in the northeast of England. This vast gap in earnings reflects broader economic disparities. London has seen significant investment in finance, technology and creative industries, while the north has suffered from decades of deindustrialization and a lack of government investment. The inequalities are not just economic, they are also health-related. There is a 10-year gap in life expectancy between people living in wealthy areas like Kensington and Chelsea and those in deprived areas like Blackpool. These disparities are a reflection of broader issues, including poorer healthcare access, higher rates of smoking, obesity, and poverty in disadvantaged regions. In response to growing regional inequalities, the UK government has launched the Levelling Up agenda, aimed at boosting economic development in the north and other disadvantaged regions. However, critics argue that progress has been slow, and without substantial long-term investment, these disparities will continue to widen. The UK's debt problem, a fiscal time bomb. Another major challenge facing the UK is its growing national debt. While borrowing increased during the COVID-19 pandemic to fund furlough schemes and business support packages, the government has continued to borrow heavily to deal with the cost of living crisis and rising energy prices. By 2023, the UK's national debt had surpassed £2.5 trillion, or 100% of GDP. While debt levels have risen in many advanced economies, the UK situation is particularly precarious due to its reliance on external financing. The OBR has warned that, by 2027, the interest payments on this debt could exceed £100 billion a year, money that could otherwise be spent on public services, infrastructure, or tax cuts. The high levels of debt mean that the UK government is limited in its ability to stimulate the economy through public spending. Any future economic shocks, such as another global recession, a spike in energy prices, or a financial crisis, could push the UK into a deeper fiscal hole. Political instability, a nation in flux. The UK's economic challenges are compounded by its political instability. Since the Brexit referendum in 2016, the country has seen a revolving door of prime ministers and cabinets. In just 7 years, the UK has had 5 different prime ministers: David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and now Rishi Sunak. Brexit has left deep political scars, not just between political parties, but within the country itself. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU, while Northern Ireland's unique position on the island of Ireland has created tensions over trade. There are growing calls for another Scottish independence referendum, while in Northern Ireland, the post-Brexit protocol has fueled political divisions and economic uncertainty. Frequent changes in leadership have made it difficult for the UK government to implement long-term economic policies. investors crave stability, and the uncertainty surrounding the UK's future trade relations, as well as domestic policies on energy, education, and infrastructure, has deterred investment and slowed economic growth. The weakening pound eroding global influence. Finally, let's talk about the British pound. Once a symbol of the UK's global economic dominance, the pound has significantly weakened over the past few years. In October 2022, the pound dropped to a historic low of $1.03 against the US dollar, following a controversial mini-budget from then-Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng that spooked financial markets. A weaker pound means that the UK pays more for imports, especially for essential goods like food and energy. This has been a key driver of inflation, as higher import costs are passed on to consumers. The UK imports about 40% of its food and much of its energy, so a weak currency puts upward pressure on prices. The decline of the pound has also eroded the UK's global buying power. British consumers now pay more for imported goods, from cars to electronics, while UK-based companies that rely on imported materials are facing rising production costs. Is the UK becoming a third-world economy? While the UK is far from becoming a literal third-world economy, the term highlights a growing sense of decline. The UK faces multiple, interconnected challenges: a post-Brexit hangover, slow growth, high inflation, rising inequality, underfunded public services, political instability, and a weakening currency. These problems have eroded living standards, and for many people, life in the UK feels harder now than it did a decade ago. But does this mean the UK is on a one-way path to economic ruin? Not necessarily. The UK still has many strengths: a world-class financial sector, leading universities, and a history of innovation. However, without serious political will to address these deep-rooted issues, particularly regional inequality, the productivity crisis, and the cost of living, there is a real risk that the UK's global influence and the living standards of its people will continue to erode.